The crack of a pistol shot echoed across the dusty street of Montana City, Montana, sending people scattering like frightened birds as Piper Ziegler clutched her satchel tighter to her chest and ran for her life. 3 men on horseback thundered after her, their faces obscured by bandanas, but their intentions clearer than the Montana sky above. It was 1878, and what had started as a routine trip to the general store had turned into a nightmare for the 22-year-old schoolteacher. "Get her!" shouted the lead bandit, his horses' hooves kicking up clouds of dust as they gained on her. Piper's heart hammered against her ribs as she darted between buildings, searching desperately for escape. Her honey-blonde hair had come loose from its pins, streaming behind her like a flag as she ran. The weight of the money she carried for the school's new books seemed to grow heavier with each step. The monthly stipend from the state had arrived that morning, and as the town's only teacher, she had been entrusted with it. Now that trust might cost her life. "Help!" She screamed, her voice barely audible over the commotion. But the once bustling Main Street had emptied, townsfolk barricading themselves behind locked doors. No one wanted to face the notorious Hill gang, who had been terrorizing the region for months. A rough hand seized her arm, yanking her sideways into the saddle of a moving horse. Piper's scream died in her throat as the breath was knocked from her lungs. The bandit smelled of whiskey and dirt, his grip bruising as he secured her across his lap. "Got myself a pretty little bonus," he growled, spurring his horse toward the edge of town as his companions whooped and hollered through tear-blurred vision. Piper caught sight of the town's sheriff emerging from his office, pistol drawn. But he was too late. The bandits were already heading for the foothills that had earned them their name, taking her with them. Miles from town, in a lonely stretch of cattle country, Quentin Porter straightened in his saddle, his keen eyes catching the plume of dust rising in the distance. At 30, the ranch foreman had learned to read the landscape like others read books, and something about that dust cloud spelled trouble. He adjusted his worn Stetson, squinting against the afternoon sun. "Boss, riders coming fast from town," he called to his employer, Thomas Green, who was inspecting a section of broken fence. Green looked up, shading his eyes. "4 of 'em riding hard." Quentin's hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver on his hip. 4 riders in a hurry usually meant nothing good in these parts. As they drew closer, he could make out 3 men and what appeared to be a woman being held against her will, her struggles visible even from this distance. "Hill gang," Green muttered, recognizing the distinctive dappled horse belonging to their leader, Jack Rattler Hill. Without hesitation, Quentin swung down from his horse. "Get back to the ranch. Alert the men and the sheriff if you can reach him." His voice was steady, but inside, fury was building. The Hill gang had been a plague on Montana City for too long, stealing cattle, robbing stagecoaches, and now, apparently, abducting women. "You can't take on all 3 alone," Green protested. "I'm not aiming to take them on," Quentin replied, eyes never leaving the distant riders. "Just to track them. Find out where they're headed." As Green reluctantly rode for help, Quentin led his horse into a stand of cottonwoods beside the creek. From this vantage point, he could observe the bandits without being seen. The riders slowed as they approached the water, evidently planning to cross and obscure their trail. The woman they carried was fighting hard despite her precarious position. Even from a distance, Quentin recognized her as Miss Ziegler, the schoolteacher who had arrived in Montana City last year. He had seen her at church socials and town meetings, always proper and reserved, with a quiet strength about her that had caught his notice more than once. Now, seeing her in the clutches of men like the Hill gang made his blood run cold. As the bandits splashed across the creek, Quentin caught fragments of their conversation, worth more than the money she was carrying. Ransom from the town. Teach them to respect the Hill gang. Quentin's jaw clenched. He would need to be careful. The Hill gang was known for their cruelty, and the schoolteacher's safety depended on his discretion. Once they had passed, He emerged from hiding and studied the ground, noting the depth of the hoof prints in the mud and the direction of the water displacement. Then, silent as a shadow, he began to follow. For Piper, the journey was a blur of terror and discomfort. Her captor, whom the others called Rattler, kept a bruising grip on her waist as they rode deeper into the hills. The other men, introduced as Mick and Sawyer, flanked them, occasionally casting leering glances in her direction that made her skin crawl. "Please," she said when they finally stopped to water the horses at a secluded spring. "The money in my satchel is all I have. It's for the school children." Rattler laughed, the sound like gravel underfoot. "We know exactly what it is, Miss Ziegler. But you see, you're worth more to us than that pitiful sum. Montana City thinks highly of its schoolteacher. They'll pay handsomely to get you back." "And if they don't?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Rattler's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then we'll have to find other ways for you to be useful." The implication hung in the air like a storm cloud. Piper swallowed hard, mind racing for a way out of this nightmare. "Mick, tie her hands. Don't want our investment wandering off," Rattler ordered, turning to replenish their canteens. The younger bandit approached with a length of rope. Piper noticed his movements were clumsy. He had been drinking from a flask throughout their journey. As he reached for her wrists, she summoned her courage and drove her knee upward, catching him squarely between the legs. With a howl of pain, he doubled over. Piper didn't hesitate. She bolted into the underbrush, ignoring the shouts and curses behind her. Branches tore at her dress and scratched her face as she crashed through the foliage, but fear gave her speed. She could hear them pursuing, their horses crashing through the brush after her. A small ravine appeared before her, and without slowing, she half slid, half tumbled down its slope, landing in a shallow stream at the bottom. The cold water shocked her system, but she pushed onward, following the stream's course in hopes it would mask her trail. Behind her, the bandits' voices grew fainter, then louder again as they discovered the ravine. Piper's lungs burned, and her sodden skirts weighed her down, but desperation kept her moving. If she could just reach denser woods, perhaps she could hide until nightfall. A root caught her foot, sending her sprawling onto the rocky stream bed. Pain shot through her ankle and a cry escaped her lips before she could stifle it. The sound echoed in the quiet forest. "Over there," came Sawyer's voice, too close for comfort. Dragging herself to her feet, Piper limped onward, but she knew it was futile. Her ankle wouldn't support her weight, and the bandits would soon overtake her. Still, surrender wasn't in her nature. She grabbed a sturdy branch from the stream bed to use as a makeshift weapon and pressed her back against a large boulder, ready to fight with whatever strength she had left. The sound of approaching hoofbeats filled her with dread. Then, unexpectedly, came the crack of a rifle shot, followed by a man's cry of pain. More gunfire erupted, and Piper huddled behind her boulder, heart pounding so loudly she was sure it could be heard for miles. Silence fell abruptly, broken only by the gentle gurgle of the stream and the distant call of a hawk. Piper held her breath, clutching her branch with white-knuckled hands. "Miss Ziegler," a deep voice, different from her captor's, called out cautiously. "It's Quentin Porter from the Green Ranch." "You're safe now." Relief washed over her, so intense that her knees nearly buckled. She recognized the name, the tall, quiet foreman who sometimes attended town functions but rarely spoke unless spoken to. She had noticed him, though, with his thoughtful eyes and the respectful way he treated everyone, regardless of their station. "Here," she called weakly, stepping out from behind the boulder. The sight that greeted her was both reassuring and alarming. Quentin Porter sat astride his chestnut gelding, rifle still in hand, his expression grim but his eyes gentle as they found her. Behind him, one of the bandits, Mick, lay motionless on the ground while there was no sign of the others. "Are you hurt, Miss Ziegler?" Quentin asked, dismounting and approaching her slowly as one might approach a spooked horse. "My ankle," she admitted, suddenly aware of how she must look, dress torn and mudded, hair a wild tangle, face scratched from branches. "I fell. And please call me Piper." Quentin nodded, keeping a respectful distance as he assessed her condition. The other two rode off, but they won't go far. We need to move quickly. He glanced at her injured ankle. May I help you onto my horse? We should get back to town before they return with reinforcements. Piper hesitated only briefly before nodding. Her ankle throbbed painfully, and the thought of the remaining bandits returning was enough to overcome any concerns about propriety. With gentle efficiency, Quentin helped her onto his horse, then mounted behind her. The closeness was improper by any standard, but given the circumstances, entirely necessary. Piper found herself acutely aware of his solid presence at her back, his arms on either side of her as he took the reins, creating a protective circle she hadn't realized how desperately she needed. I've been tracking them since they took you from town, he explained as they started back, taking a different route than the one she had come. Sheriff Daniels and some men from the ranch should be not far behind, but I couldn't wait once I heard you cry out. Piper's throat tightened with emotion. You followed them alone. That was incredibly dangerous. Couldn't just let them take you, he replied simply, as if there had been no other option. Besides, I know these hills better than they do, been riding them since I was a boy. As they rode, Piper became aware of a warm stickiness against her arm. Turning slightly, she gasped when she realized Quentin's shirt sleeve was dark with blood. You're wounded, she exclaimed. He glanced down, seeming surprised. It's nothing. Bullet just grazed me in the exchange. I've had worse from breaking horses. It needs tending, she insisted, her teacher's voice emerging despite their situation. And don't tell me it's nothing. Blood is never nothing, Mr. Porter. A small smile touched his lips. If I'm to call you Piper, then I'm Quentin. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching riders put them both on alert. Quentin's hand moved to his gun, but he relaxed when Sheriff Daniels and 4 ranch hands came into view, riding hard toward them. The reunion was brief and businesslike. The sheriff, a stout man with a walrus mustache, took one look at Piper's condition and Quentin's bloodied arm and ordered them back to town immediately, promising to pursue the remaining bandits himself. Green's wife was a nurse during the war, one of the ranch hands told them. She can see to both of you at the ranch. It's closer than town. And so, as the sheriff's posse continued into the hills, Quentin guided his horse toward Green Ranch, Piper still secure in his protective embrace. Despite her ordeal, despite her pain and exhaustion, she found herself aware of a curious feeling taking root something beyond gratitude, something she wasn't quite ready to name. The Green Ranch house stood like a fortress against the backdrop of the Montana wilderness, solid and reassuring. Sarah Green, a sturdy woman with kind eyes and capable hands, took one look at the bedraggled pair on her doorstep and sprang into action. Thomas, heat water, she commanded her husband, and fetch my medical box from the pantry. Within minutes, Piper found herself seated in a comfortable kitchen chair, her injured ankle being expertly examined while Quentin submitted to having his arm cleaned and bandaged at the other end of the large farm table. Despite Mrs. Green's objections, he had refused treatment until Piper was seen to. A bad sprain, not broken, Mrs. Green pronounced finally, wrapping Piper's ankle with practiced efficiency. You'll need to stay off it for a few days, but it should heal nicely. I can't impose, Piper began, but Mrs. Green waved away her protest. Nonsense. You'll stay here until you're fit to travel. Thomas has already sent word to town that you're safe, so your friends won't worry. Across the table, Quentin winced slightly as Mrs. Green tied off his bandage. The bullet just grazed the muscle, she told him. You were lucky. Wasn't luck, Thomas Green said, returning with a tray of steaming cups. It was skill. Quentin's the best tracker in the territory. Once he sets his mind to finding something, he doesn't stop until he does. Quentin looked uncomfortable with the praise, focusing instead on thanking Mrs. Green for her ministrations. Piper watched him, seeing beyond his quiet demeanor to the courage that had driven him to follow 3 armed men alone. Thank you, she said softly when their hosts had moved to prepare rooms for them. You saved my life today. Quentin met her eyes, and something in his gaze made her breath catch. Anyone would have done the same. No, she said firmly, not anyone, most would have waited for the sheriff. You didn't. A hint of color touched his tanned cheeks and he looked down at his bandaged arm. I couldn't bear the thought of you in their hands, not for a minute longer than necessary. The simple honesty of his words touched something deep within Piper. Before she could respond, however, Mrs. Green returned to usher her upstairs to rest, and the moment passed. That night, lying in the Greens' spare bedroom with her ankle propped on a pillow, Piper found sleep elusive. Every time she closed her eyes, she relived the terror of her abduction, the rough hands grabbing her, the leering faces of the bandits. But always, as her dreams threatened to turn to nightmares, another image would appear: Quentin Porter riding to her rescue, his steady presence a shield against harm. Dawn was just breaking when a soft knock at her door roused her from a fitful slumber. Miss Ziegler, Mrs. Green's voice came through the wood. The sheriff is here. He'd like to speak with you if you're up to it. Piper quickly arranged her borrowed nightgown more modestly and called for them to enter. Sheriff Daniels appeared, hat in hand, his expression grave. Morning, Miss Ziegler. Good to see you recovering. He shifted uncomfortably. I need to ask you about yesterday. Anything you can tell us about the men who took you? For the next half hour, Piper recounted every detail she could remember: descriptions of the men, fragments of conversations overheard, landmarks she had noticed during her captivity and escape. The sheriff nodded, occasionally making notes in a small book. You've been most helpful, he said finally. We tracked the remaining two to a camp about 10 miles into the hills, but they'd fled by the time we arrived, left in a hurry by the looks of it. Found this, though. He held out her satchel, the leather worn but intact. The money's gone, I'm afraid. But we found some of your personal effects inside. Piper accepted it with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the unexpected return of even this small piece of her normal life. Inside were her teaching notes, a few letters from her sister in Ohio, and a small daguerreotype of her parents' irreplaceable items she had thought lost forever. Thank you, she whispered, clutching the satchel to her chest. The sheriff nodded awkwardly. Just doing my job. Unlike some who take matters into their own hands. There was a note of disapproval in his voice that Piper didn't miss. Mr. Porter saved my life, she said firmly. If he hadn't followed when he did— Yes, the sheriff interrupted. Very brave, also very foolhardy. Could have gotten you both killed. He sighed, replacing his hat. But I suppose I can't argue with results. You're safe, and one of the Hill gang won't be troubling anyone again. After he left, Mrs. Green helped Piper dress and make her way downstairs for breakfast. The kitchen was filled with delicious smells and morning light, creating an atmosphere so normal it almost made yesterday's events seem like a bad dream. Quentin was already seated at the table, his injured arm held slightly away from his body. He stood when she entered, his eyes quickly assessing her condition before he pulled out a chair for her. How's the ankle this morning? He asked as she settled herself, Mrs. Green placing a plate of eggs and bacon before her. Better, I think, Piper replied, though in truth it still throbbed painfully. And your arm? Fine, he said, in the same dismissive tone he'd used yesterday. Mrs. Green snorted. Men, you could be bleeding to death and you'd say you're fine. She set down a plate for Quentin with considerably more force than necessary. He had fever in the night. I found him trying to saddle his horse at 3 in the morning, claiming he needed to make sure the trail was cold. Quentin looked embarrassed. I was concerned the remaining bandits might circle back. With a bullet wound and fever? What good would you have been? Mrs. Green shook her head. Stubborn as a mule, this one. Despite everything, Piper found herself smiling at the exchange. There was something comforting about Mrs. Green's maternal scolding and Quentin's sheepish acceptance of it. After breakfast, Mr. Green helped Piper to a comfortable chair on the wide front porch, where she could rest with her ankle elevated and enjoy the fresh air. To her surprise, Quentin joined her a short while later, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Mrs. Green said you might like some company, he explained, offering her one of the cups. But I can leave if you'd prefer to be alone. Please stay, Piper said, perhaps too quickly. I'd welcome the company. He settled into the chair beside hers, and for a time they sat in companionable silence, watching the ranch hands go about their morning chores in the distance. Have you been with the Greens long? Piper finally asked, curious about this quiet man who had risked so much for her. 10 years now, Quentin replied. Started as a hand, worked my way up to foreman. They're good people, treat their workers fair. And before that, a shadow crossed his face. War, cavalry, before that, grew up on a small farm in Wisconsin, not much to tell. But Piper sensed there was much more behind his spare words. The pain that flickered in his eyes when he mentioned the war told a story his words did not. I came west after losing my parents to influenza, she offered, understanding instinctively that he might speak more freely if she shared first. My sister married and moved to Ohio. I wanted a fresh start, somewhere I could be useful. When I saw the advertisement for a teacher in Montana City, it seemed like providence. Quentin nodded, his gaze on the distant mountains. It takes courage to start over somewhere new. As does following armed bandits alone, she countered. A small smile touched his lips. Different kind of courage. Is it? Piper sipped her coffee, finding it strong but good. I think courage is courage, whether it's facing bullets or facing a classroom of children who'd rather be anywhere else. That earned a genuine chuckle from him, transforming his serious face. Fair point, Miss Piper. Over the next few days, as Piper's ankle slowly healed, these porch conversations became a daily ritual. Quentin would join her in the morning after his early chores and again in the evenings after supper. Gradually, his reticence gave way to more open conversation. She learned about his experiences in the war, the nightmares that still sometimes plagued him, and his dreams of one day having a place of his own. In turn, she told him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, her love of teaching, and her secret ambition to write stories for children. He listened with genuine interest, never dismissing her aspirations as many men might have. On the fourth day, when Piper was able to walk short distances with the aid of a cane Mrs. Green had found, Quentin suggested they visit the small garden behind the house. Mrs. Green is quite proud of it, he explained as he helped her navigate the uneven ground. Says it's her piece of civilization in the wilderness. The garden was indeed beautiful, with neat rows of vegetables interspersed with flowering plants that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. A small bench sat beneath an apple tree, providing shade from the afternoon sun. As they settled on the bench, Piper became acutely aware of Quentin's proximity. His arm, healing well according to Mrs. Green, brushed against hers, and she felt a flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with her ordeal. I received word from town this morning, Quentin said after a moment. The school board met. They've decided to replace the stolen funds for your books. Piper's eyes widened. That's wonderful news, but how? The town's resources are already stretched thin. The ranchers took up a collection. Mr. Green contributed a fair sum, said education benefits us all. He hesitated. I added what I could as well. Touched beyond words, Piper impulsively placed her hand over his. Thank you. That's incredibly generous. Quentin looked down at their hands, then slowly turned his palm upward, his fingers gently intertwining with hers. The gesture was tentative, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, but Piper found she had no desire to do so. I've enjoyed our talks these past days, he said, his voice lower than usual. More than I can say. As have I, Piper admitted, her heart beating a rapid tattoo against her ribs. He met her eyes then, and what she saw in his gaze took her breath away. Admiration, certainly, but also a warmth and longing that mirrored her own feelings. When you're well enough to return to town, he said carefully, would you permit me to call on you? Properly, I mean. The question hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. Piper was acutely aware that accepting would set them on a path neither could fully predict. She was a schoolteacher, expected to maintain the highest standards of behavior. He was a ranch foreman, respected but not of the social standing many would consider appropriate for her. Yet in the face of those considerations, one fact remained clearer than all others. In the short time she had known Quentin Porter, he had shown her more genuine respect, understanding, and care than any man she had ever met. "I would like that very much," she answered, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. His smile then was like the sun breaking through clouds, transforming his normally serious countenance. Without words, he raised their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture at once old-fashioned and deeply intimate. The moment was interrupted by Mrs. Green calling them for supper, but something had shifted between them. A door opened that neither wished to close. 2 days later, Piper returned to her small house on the edge of Montana City. The townspeople welcomed her back with a mixture of relief and curiosity, eager for details of her ordeal and rescue. She provided the basic facts, but kept the more personal aspects of her recovery at the Green Ranch to herself, treasuring them like precious gems. True to his word, Quentin called on her the following Sunday after church. He appeared at her door in his best shirt, hair neatly combed, a bouquet of wildflowers in hand. The sight of him standing on her porch, uncharacteristically nervous, filled Piper with a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer heat. They walked together through town, mindful of curious eyes but too absorbed in each other's company to truly care what others might think. Quentin told her about the progress the sheriff had made in tracking the remaining members of the Hill Gang, reportedly now fled to Wyoming territory, while Piper shared her plans for the new school term. Over the following weeks, these Sunday walks became an established ritual. Sometimes they would picnic by the creek, where they had first encountered each other under such different circumstances. Other times, they would simply sit on Piper's small porch, reading aloud from books they both enjoyed or discussing the news from the eastern papers that arrived sporadically in Montana City. Rumors inevitably circulated about the schoolteacher and the ranch foreman, but for once, Piper found she didn't mind being the subject of town gossip. The whispers seemed trivial compared to what she and Quentin had experienced together. As summer turned to fall, their feelings for each other deepened. Quentin began accompanying Piper to town functions, standing proudly at her side during harvest festivals and school events. Though never demonstrative in public, both were too reserved by nature for that the connection between them was evident to anyone who cared to look. It was at the harvest dance in late September that things changed once again. Piper had worn her best dress, a deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes. Quentin, in a new suit purchased for the occasion, had hardly left her side all evening, his normally solemn face softening whenever their eyes met. As the evening wound down, he asked her to step outside for a moment. The night air was crisp with the promise of autumn, stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust. "I'm not a man of many words," Quentin began, taking her hands in his. "But I want you to know that these past months have been the happiest of my life." Piper squeezed his hands, encouraging him to continue. "When I saw those men taking you that day," he went on, his voice rough with emotion, "I felt something I hadn't felt since the war, that fear of losing something precious before I'd even properly found it." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box, carefully carved with a pattern of wildflowers. "I made this for you. Open it." With trembling fingers, Piper lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft cloth, lay a ring, a simple gold band with a small but perfect pearl set in its center. "It was my mother's," Quentin explained softly. "The only thing of value I have from before the war. Piper Ziegler, I love you. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears blurred Piper's vision as joy surged through her. "Yes," she whispered, then more firmly, "Yes, Quentin, I will." His kiss was gentle but filled with promise, sealing their commitment under the vast Montana sky. They were married on a bright October day, with the aspen trees glowing gold against the mountains. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, even Sheriff Daniels, who had initially been skeptical of their match but had eventually conceded that Quentin's actions had proven his worth. The Greens stood as witnesses, Mrs. Green dabbing at her eyes throughout the ceremony while her husband pretended not to notice his own emotional reaction. They presented the newlyweds with a gift that left both speechless: a deed to 20 acres adjoining the Green Ranch, with timber for building and good water access. "Been saving it for the right hand to come along," Mr. Green explained gruffly. "Someone who'd work it proper." Looks like he finally did. The gift allowed Quentin to realize his dream of having his own land while remaining close enough for Piper to continue teaching, at least for now. Together, they began planning the home they would build, a place that would combine the best of both their worlds. Winter settled over Montana, bringing with it long evenings by the fire in the small cabin Quentin had hastily constructed before the first snows. It was snug and simple, but to Piper, it was paradise. Each day, she would teach at the schoolhouse in town, then return home to find Quentin working on plans for their permanent home or tending to the few animals they had acquired. Their evenings were filled with quiet conversation, rating and increasingly planning for the future. By Christmas, Piper was certain she was with child, a secret she shared with Quentin on Christmas morning as they exchanged modest gifts. His response was everything she could have hoped for: joy, wonder, and a fierce protectiveness that made her feel safer than she ever had before. "A baby," he repeated, placing his hand reverently over her still flat stomach. "Our baby." The news seemed to drive Quentin to work even harder on their permanent home. Through the remainder of winter and into spring, he labored alongside hired hands from town, determined to have the house ready before the baby arrived. Piper continued teaching until the end of the school term in May, by which time her condition was obvious to all. The school board, surprisingly progressive for the time, had already hired a temporary replacement, with the understanding that Piper might return once the baby was older if she wished. Their son was born on a stormy night in July 1879, nearly a year after Piper's abduction. They named him James Thomas Porter, honoring both Quentin's father and Thomas Green, who had become like family to them both. As Piper cradled their newborn son, Quentin sat beside her on their bed in the newly completed house, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and wonder. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted softly, gently touching the baby's tiny hand. "After the war, I thought some things weren't meant for men like me." "What things?" Piper asked, though she already knew the answer. "Peace," he said simply. "Happiness, a family of my own." Piper leaned against him, their son sleeping peacefully between them. "Sometimes the things we think are lost forever are just waiting to be found," she said. "Like you found me." Quentin's arm tightened around her shoulders. "I would have followed you to the ends of the earth," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know," Piper replied, and she did. The man who had tracked her through hostile territory with no thought for his own safety was the same man who now watched over her and their child with unwavering devotion. "That's why I love you." Outside, the storm began to subside, rain giving way to the clean, fresh scent of renewal. Within their home, built with love and determination, the Porter family slept, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together. As young James grew, so too did the Porter homestead. By the time he was 3, they had a prosperous small ranch with a herd of quality cattle, chickens that provided eggs for their table, and a vegetable garden that was Piper's pride and joy. Their nearest neighbors were still the Greens, who doted on James as if he were their own grandchild. Piper had returned to teaching part-time when James turned 2, bringing him with her 3 days a week to the schoolhouse in town. The arrangement worked well, with the older children often taking turns entertaining the toddler during their breaks. Watching her son's natural curiosity and love of learning blossom, Piper felt a deep satisfaction in the life she and Quentin had built. Montana City had changed as well. The railroad had finally reached them, bringing new settlers, businesses, and opportunities. The Hill Gang was a memory now, its members either dead or imprisoned far away. Occasionally, when riding near the foothills where her ordeal had begun, Piper would feel a phantom chill, but Quentin's steady presence always banished such ghosts. On their 4th wedding anniversary after James was asleep, Quentin presented Piper with a leather-bound book. Opening it, she discovered it was filled with blank pages, save for an inscription on the first page in Quentin's careful handwriting, "For your stories. The ones you'll write for our children and others, your voice deserves to be heard." Tears filled Piper's eyes as she traced the words with her fingertips. "You remembered everything," he said simply. "I remember everything you've ever told me." That night, as moonlight filtered through the curtains of their bedroom, Piper reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From terror and violence had come this profound love, this partnership that strengthened with each passing day. Quentin had once said he would have followed her to the ends of the earth, and she knew it wasn't just words, he had proven it with actions, not just on that fateful day in the hills, but every day since. In the years that followed, the Porter family grew. A daughter, Sarah, joined them in 1883, followed by another son, Robert, in 1886. Their home expanded accordingly, with Quentin adding rooms as needed, always with an eye toward comfort and practicality. Piper's stories, initially written just for her children, eventually found their way to a publisher in Denver through a chance meeting with a traveling book salesman. Her first collection of frontier tales for young readers was published in 1887 under her maiden name at her publisher's suggestion. P. Ziegler's Montana stories became popular throughout the Western Territories, their authentic depiction of frontier life and positive messages resonating with families seeking to instill proper values in their children. Quentin, ever supportive, built her a small study adjacent to their bedroom where she could write undisturbed when inspiration struck. He took pride in her success, often reading her latest stories to the children at bedtime, his deep voice bringing the characters to life in ways that delighted both the children and Piper herself. Their ranch prospered as well. Quentin's careful management and innovative approaches to cattle breeding gained recognition beyond Montana territory. Young ranchers sought his advice, and he was eventually persuaded to serve on the Territorial Livestock Commission, a position that required occasional travel but brought both income and respect. Through it all, their partnership remained the foundation of their success. They faced challenges together: droughts, harsh winters, financial setbacks, with the same determination that had characterized their beginnings. And always, the memory of those early days served as a reminder of how precious their life together truly was. By 1898, 20 years after their first meeting, Piper and Quentin had become fixtures in the community. James, now 19, had gone east to attend college, the first in either of their families to do so. Sarah, 15, showed every sign of following in her mother's footsteps, with a love of books and teaching that seemed ingrained in her nature. Robert, 12, was his father's shadow, already showing aptitude for the ranch work that was Quentin's passion. On a crisp autumn evening, much like the night Quentin had proposed so long ago, they sat together on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Quentin's hair was now streaked with silver, and fine lines framed Piper's eyes, but to each other, they were as beautiful as they had been in their youth. "Do you ever wonder," Piper asked softly, her hand in his as it had been countless times over the years, "what would have happened if the Hill Gang had never taken me that day?" Quentin considered this, his thumb tracing slow circles on the back of her hand. "I've thought about it," he admitted. "I like to think our paths would have crossed eventually, that some things are meant to be, regardless of how they begin." Piper smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. the quiet foreman and the schoolteacher. We might have danced around each other for years, too shy to speak what was in our hearts. Probably, Quentin agreed with a low chuckle. I was never good with words, still aren't, I suppose. Your actions have always spoken loudly enough, Piper said, thinking of all the ways he had shown his love over their years together, the home he had built, the support he had given her dreams, the partnership they had forged against all odds. As darkness fell, bringing with it the first stars of evening, Piper reflected on the journey that had led them here. From the terror of that day in the hills to this peaceful moment on their porch, they had traveled a path neither could have imagined. What had begun in violence had transformed into a life of love, creativity, and purpose. I would follow you still, Quentin said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. Anywhere you needed to go. Piper turned to face him, the man who had once tracked her through wilderness and had never stopped watching over her since. I know, she said, reaching up to trace the beloved contours of his face. But here is where I want to be, with you, always. Their kiss, tender yet filled with the depth of their shared history, was a promise renewed not just of love, but of the partnership that had sustained them through 2 decades of challenges and joys. In the house behind them, their children moved about their evening routines. In the fields beyond, cattle grazed peacefully on land that had prospered under their care. And in their hearts, the story that had begun with a desperate chase through the Montana hills continued to unfold, a testament to the enduring power of courage, devotion, and love that refuses to surrender, no matter how difficult the trail.